Hey, welcome. Today we're going to start talking about post-World War II and the Cold War era. And we're going to start by talking about the end of World War II and the beginning of Cold War. So the end of World War II brings major changes to the world. The Axis, which includes Germany, Italy, and Japan, were defeated during World War II. The Western European countries are devastated by World War II, so that's Britain, France, Belgium, and others. And this leaves the United States and the Soviet Union to emerge from World War II as the superpowers. Western Europe has destruction to agriculture, transportation, and industry, loss of lives, and economic problems that cause it to be weakened. So for hundreds of years, Western Europe had kind of dominated the global economy, kind of been the most powerful countries in the world, but now they are going to be behind Soviet Union and the United States. The United States was isolated from much of the destruction during the war, and they profited by selling weapons and supplies during the war to Britain and other countries. And so they end up leaving World War II in a better spot than when they entered. Soviet Union struggles early on. Their infrastructure is destroyed, so that would be their roads, their buildings, the things that they need to survive economically, like factories and such. And then over 40 million people died in the Soviet Union during World War II, many of which were civilians. But on the positive side, they had growing industrial capacity, which means their industries are growing, their factories are getting stronger, and they had lots of natural resources. And much of this is from them using Eastern Europe and the land that they conquered toward the end of the war in Eastern Europe to help them rebuild. And they get a lot of support from Eastern Europe. Early on, some of it's voluntarily, but by the end, most of it is forced support. So the United Nations is going to replace the League of Nations. The League of Nations show that they weren't really all that powerful and that they were weak, as they refused to use force to stop Italy or Japan or Germany. So unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations, or the UN, could use military force to stop an aggressor. The downside is Stalin got the group to give permanent members of the United Nations Security Council veto power. So they will not respond with force if one of these five are involved, and the five permanent members are the United States, Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China. So if the Soviet Union is involved, the Soviet Union can veto anything the United Nations would do to stop them. So this leads to the beginning of the Cold War. The Allies worked together to win World War II, but things are breaking apart before the war is even over. The distrust between the Soviet Union and the United States is going to increase towards the end of the war and increase even more after the war is over. The United States cuts off aid to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is struggling from the war, and people are starving. And then Stalin's going to go back on a lot of his promises, such as promising to have free elections in Poland, and instead is going to force Poland to be a communist government. Post-war conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union becomes known as the Cold War, and it's called a Cold War because they did not directly fight each other. It was a war mostly over economics and politics and ideologies, although there are actual wars that took place during the Cold War involving the United States or the Soviet Union. The United States and the Soviet Union distrusted each other, and they also disagreed on most important issues. The United States was capitalist and democratic, whereas the Soviet Union was communist and a dictatorship. The United States wanted to prevent the spread of communism, where the Soviet Union was communist and wanted to spread communism. Soviet Union wanted to create satellite nations in Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. So this would be countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, that would be reliant on the Soviet Union and support them and help them. And a buffer zone would prevent them from getting invaded by Germany or France or any other country again. And then the United States also exited World War II with the goal of becoming a world economic power and dominating the world economy. The differences between the Soviet Union and the United States ends up causing NATO and Warsaw Pact to be formed. So Western European and American countries formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, more commonly known as NATO. And this is a military alliance to stop or to counter Soviet expansionism and prevent the spread of communism. And then the Soviet Union, a few years later, so NATO was formed in 1949. Soviet Union made the Warsaw Pact in 1955, where its eastern satellite countries agreed to form a military alliance to support the Soviet Union as a response to NATO. And in the picture here, you can see the blue would be NATO, and the red would be Warsaw Pact. So NATO is mostly made up of North American and Western European countries. As you can see here, it was led by the United States, but you also have Britain, France, Canada, and several other nations involved in NATO. Warsaw Pact was led by the Soviet Union, which you can see over here, and includes a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, including Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. And the countries that weren't part of NATO or Warsaw were generally referred to as third world countries. Competition was fierce during the Cold War. Cold War was a struggle for power between the United States and the Soviet Union. You have an arms race where both sides are trying to develop more powerful weapons. The United States develops the hydrogen bomb or the atomic bomb and uses it at the end of World War II to defeat Japan. Soviet Union a few years later will develop their own atomic bomb. Then you go on to develop, the United States goes on to develop the hydrogen bomb, which is much stronger than the nuclear bomb. And both sides compete to develop better systems of delivering weapons with missiles and missile guidance systems. Eventually, weapons get pretty extreme, and people turn their focus to the space race instead. So space race was over space supremacy and basically trying to prove who's ahead scientifically between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union probably was ahead of us in most regards. They were first to send a man into orbit, send a satellite into orbit. The United States claims that they won the space race by landing a man on the moon, but the Soviet Union was doing other things at that time and not really focused on a man on the moon, but sending satellites into outer planets in our solar system. The economy was a major part of the competition, and one where the United States soundly defeated the Soviet Union. The Olympics was another way they could compete. You can see this both in competitions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Thinking of basketball, when the Soviet Union upset the United States for the gold medal, or hockey in 1980 in New York, when the U.S. upset the Soviet team in the semifinals and went on to win a gold medal. You can also see it between various countries. You have the blood and water match, where there was tension between these countries, and in a water polo match, they had to call it off because it was so violent. And just the propaganda as well, with figure skating and other sports that were judged by judges. You had an Eastern Bloc and a Western Bloc. The Eastern Bloc would vote much lower for the Western Bloc, and the Western Bloc would vote much lower for the Eastern Bloc. So if an American figure skater was figure skating, she'd score really well with Canada and Britain and France and other NATO countries, but not so well with Poland or East Germany or the Soviet Union or Warsaw Pact countries. Espionage was big during the Cold War. This is spies. This is kind of the idea that James Bond and several other movies were based off of. And then propaganda, trying to show that your country is better than the other country. The United States portrayed the Soviet Union as evil and the United States as good. We viewed the Soviet Union as impersonal, non-emotional, no personality, and the Soviet Union portrayed the United States as being greedy, capitalist, and just very full of themselves and unconcerned with other people. Both sides possess nuclear weapons. The first two countries developed nuclear weapons, and both sides lived in fear of nuclear attack from the other. Strangely, the one thing that prevented a nuclear attack between the countries was a policy called mutually assured destruction, which meant that we didn't launch nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union because they would retaliate, and they wouldn't launch nuclear missiles at us because we would retaliate. And if that happened, then pretty much the world would be destroyed, which was close to happening during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Soviet Union and the United States did not fight each other directly during the Cold War, but both sides used proxy armies to fight indirectly. The United States sent soldiers into Korea and Vietnam, and the Soviet Union gave aid to those the United States was fighting. China became involved in the Korean War, and then the Soviet Union fought in the Soviet-Afghan War, and the United States sent aid to those that the Soviets were fighting against in Afghanistan. And there's a lot of similarities between the Vietnam War and the Soviet-Afghan War, and neither war was very popular in the home country. So Vietnam was not real popular in the United States, and the Soviet-Afghan War was not very popular in the Soviet Union. You also have the Iran-Iraq War, which helped put Saddam Hussein in. So in general, when the United States would be fighting a war during the Cold War, the Soviet Union would support whoever the United States was fighting against, and vice versa. Whenever the Soviet Union was fighting a war, the United States would support whoever the Soviet Union was fighting against, and these become known as proxy wars, where the United States and the Soviet Union do not directly fight each other because that could lead to a nuclear war, but instead supported other people and had them do the fighting on their behalf. So we're continuing talking about post-World War II and the Cold War era. Next time we're going to focus on Germany in the Cold War era. We're going to talk about the partition of Germany and the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, and the Berlin Wall. All right, thanks for listening. Have any questions, let me know. I'll talk to you later. Bye.